We are at a stage in the calendar, in the political calendar, where there's going to be some uncertainty. There will be electoral pressures on both sides. So we have to see how that pans out. Now, I want to step back and talk a little bit about the global economy and India's prospects. The prospects of meeting a $5 trillion economy. I think there are two very, very strong forces working in India's favor. And the way I think about it as a kind of growth economist is to say that, India's per capita GDP, roughly, I'm speaking roughly in PPP terms, is something like $6,000 per capita. The frontier is probably, $65,000–$70,000 per capita. So economists have something called a phenomenon known as convergence. So if you are far away from the frontier, there is a lot of headroom to grow, provided a country does basically, avoids all the traps, and policies are minimally kind of supportive. So a 6,000 per capita GDP economy has another 10, 15, 20 years to grow, potentially, at 6, 7, 8, 9%, and the kind of growth rates that the East Asians saw, China saw, and so on. So that convergence is positive. And then, of course, the other thing that's going for India is what might be called a series of connectivity revolutions. I coined the phrase jam, but there's a physical connectivity revolution because of infrastructure being laid. There's a digital connectivity revolution, mobile data, and there's a financial connectivity revolution because of all the people coming into the formal financial sector. So this connectivity revolution is going to be very plus for India. But none of these things are entitlements. No country can take these as automatically delivering higher growth and development. These are opportunities which have to be seized by providing a very supportive policy environment. Which leads me to my last point, is that on the one hand there are all these opportunities, but I think the global environment fundamentally has shifted, I think, a little bit in the adverse direction, because there is this massive globalization backlash going on. I think between the US and China, we're thinking not just in terms of a trade war, but a fundamental reassessment of each other's geostrategic situation, which could mean something much more than a trade war, a tech war, a strategic kind of standoff. That doesn't bode very well for the world over. All emerging market countries are going to be caught in that. And of course there is the whole point about our services exports, our manufacturing exports are going to be affected by the international environment. So I think in terms of that globalization backlash, we have to, I think, try and overcome that with supportive and better policies at home. And so fundamentally the future is potentially very bright. There are all these possibilities. There are also a number of challenges emerging. Many of them I haven't mentioned, but the big one being the kind of globalization backlash internationally. But all of this, whether we kind of realize the opportunities, face off, head off the threats, will depend fundamentally on what we do at home. And there are a number of kind of medium-term challenges. I will just end by saying two of them which affect both the short run and the long run are the financial sector and agriculture, and we can talk about more of those in the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Subramanian, and I agree with you. It's the financial sector and agrarian mess that's going to perhaps arrest our growth. But before I go any further, and for all of you interested in more macroeconomy perspective, Off Council, The Challenges of the Modi-Jaitley Economy is a book that is a must-read for all of you interested in the larger landscape of Indian economy. He's out with this book after his years as CA. It is a must-read. I've read it and I can vouch for it. But Dr. Subramanian, before I go any further and before I talk really about the macroeconomy and all of that, we also must not lose sight of our institutions, and I can't not ask you the news question. The markets may have taken it in their stride, the resignation of an RBI governor in a very unprecedented sort of a way. But do you believe the damage has been permanent? I will talk about the new incumbent right up next, but just a quick opening question in terms of the exit of the RBI governor and what sort of a damage does it do to perception and things otherwise?
You see, I think, the way to think about this, the way I think about it is really that one has to focus on the underlying policies, not on individuals and, short-term circumstances. And I think the key things for me are the following. I think the outgoing governor and the RBI more recently have embarked on two, I think, very important policy agendas, as it were. One was, of course, restoring credibly kind of the integrity of the financial system. Remember that, we have been in India about 8-9 years into what I've called the twin balance sheet crisis. 2018, we made great strides in terms of the bankruptcy code, but 2018 also, threw, to use a cricketing metaphor, many googlies at the financial system. And I think the RBI had made taken some commendable steps, whether it was the prompt corrective action, whether it was, dealing with the NBFCs, whether it was dealing with, individual private banks. I think there was a very solid agenda there. Of course, there was some oversight in terms of, the NBFCs and ILFS and so on. But there was a very strong agenda for restoring the financial system. And I think what's going to be key is whether this is maintained going forward or not. I think that's going to be the yardstick for measuring what's happening, on the bigger institutional front. I think the second, I think it's fair to say, the second big institutional agenda was, preserving what you called, preserving and maintaining the strength of the RBI, both technically, but also, in terms of decision making and governance. I think that that also needs to be preserved going forward, and that we'll have to wait and see. I want to say here that that whole institutional thing that you raised has two dimensions to this, right? One is the ability of the RBI, which has a very good reputation for very good reasons, maintaining the functional autonomy, decision-making, governance on the one hand. I think that's absolutely sacred. We must not compromise on that. But equally, I think that there must be, more open communication, cooperation, consultation between government and RBI. And so, if that balance is struck, you maintain the independence, you create better systems of cooperation. I think that's what we have to assess going forward, not individuals or current circumstances.
The new incumbent of RBI is obviously somebody who worked very closely with Shaktikanta Das. Many people thought it was inevitable that the government is going to appoint a career bureaucrat in that position. What is the message, do you believe, has been sent out with Mr. Das's appointment as the boss of Min Street, and what should his key priorities be? Because this isn't just another appointment. He's coming at a time when the relationship between the central government and the central bank reached a point of no return. Does his immediate priority list include restoring the relationship, the channels of communication, before really looking at the financial system, the banks and everything else?
I think, these are all related. I think the key priorities going forward will have to be, how do you restore, the integrity of the financial system? As I said, we are 8-9 years into the twin balance sheet crisis. Arguably, it's actually grown in the last year with all these, financial scandals and the emergence of a new bunch of non-performing assets or potential non-performing assets. And, of course, maintaining the independence and credibility of the RBI. But as I said, that is sacred, inviolate. I think it matters a lot for the long run, but that has to be preserved. But at the same time, communication, whatever, all those things that make for better decision making overall finally, those have to be improved as well. So that's what we have to judge what happens going forward.
I know you've been a very vocal proponent of reviewing the whole capital framework. You've spoken about reserves very openly. At a time like this, when there is obviously, the big bone of contention between the RBI and the central government was what should one be doing with reserves. What do you think needs to be done with reserves? Of course, RBI is sitting on, a lot of reserves. The government believes it can be put to some productive use. The suspicion in the public discourse and the economic narrative is, could this be used to plug the deficit? What is your own take on reserves, and how do you believe this is best managed?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think the outcome that they've arrived at is to review the whole capital framework. I think is a very positive way forward, and that's what I think many of us recommended several years ago. But there, I think there are two very clear and distinct, issues. There's first the technical issue of whether, in fact, the RBI has, I think just to avoid confusion, I think we should call this excess capital and not excess reserves, because reserves relate to foreign exchange reserves and people get confused. The question is whether the RBI has too much government capital in it. So there's going to be a technical evaluation of that. I and my co-authors have made an evaluation. So that's one component, and I think the committee should look into that. My own view is that there is some excess reserves, and they can come to a different opinion, but that's a technical opinion. But that has to be very distinct from what are the policy implications, even if there are excess reserves. And there my views have always been very, very clear, and I'll summarize it in 3 or 4 bullet points. One, insofar as there are excess reserves, they must only be used for restoring the financial system, recapitalizing the bank, and that too only if reforms are undertaken in the public sector banks. Even if there are excess reserves, even in order to put it into recapitalizing the banks, there must be fundamental governance reforms. Otherwise, it will be throwing good money after bad into a black hole. That's point number one. Point number two is that a corollary of that is that this money must not be used for regular financing of the deficit or other expenditure. And just to give viewers a sense of intuitively why that is the case, I think you should think of excess capital essentially as cumulative savings built up over time. In a commercial bank, the equivalent would be profits. This is, in a sense, cumulative profits, savings built up. So when you build up savings, you use it not for consumption or for expenditure, but you use it for long-term investment, and investing in the financial system is such a long-term investment. So that's point number two. Point number three is, and I'm adamant about that as well, that it should be done cooperatively, not unilaterally by the government or the RBI. And I think this, the whole arrangement now to set up a committee, I think goes a long way in that direction. Any sense that, these excess capital is used to finance current expenditure or finance a deficit would, I think, legitimately be seen as quote-unquote raiding the RBI.
And that is such a dangerous term to use in an economic narrative, raiding the reserves. So do it voluntarily, do not use it for plugging the deficit, and also use it only for bank recapitalization. The other bone of contention, I know you have a view on this, and just for the benefit of our audience and the viewers watching us, is obviously NBFCs. The big bone of contention is that the government believes the NBFC space needs more liquidity. The RBI believes system-wide liquidity is sufficient and would not want to put the economy on steroids. Do we run the risk of excessive lending and then that landing us back into what 2009 landed us?
I think there is a serious risk of that. You see, remember that, you know that I've coined these 5 R's for, resolving this, recognition, resolution, recapitalization, reform, and regulation. But, the first one is recognition. That is, we come clean on, potential bad assets in the system. Now, the point is that in the last 1 year, we had thought that, with the asset quality review that the RBI had done for the banks, we thought we had broadly a sense of what, the magnitude of bad or potentially bad assets were in the system. But with the whole ILFS and the fact that there has been a lot of, lending by the NBFCs in the last 2-3 years, I think once again raises the doubt that there might be much more toxic assets in the NBFC system and via that back into the banking system as well. So my plea would be, my urge would be, and it's kind of a new suggestion, is just as we did an asset quality review which made everything transparent and which also then galvanized policy action because people knew what the magnitude of the problem was. I think similarly we should do an asset quality review of the NBFCs to get a sense of the problem and to come clean on the magnitude of the problem. I think if we don't do that and then we kind of open the spigots knowing that these NBFCs by definition, because they're less tightly regulated, the potential for risky lending intrinsically is greater there. Remember, the NBFC model is kind of different from the banking model. The banking model theoretically is low return, low risk. The NBFC model is high return, high risk. So by definition, the risks are greater in the NBFC system. So if we're going to open the spigots there, we need to be extremely careful and prudent and have the regulatory kind of oversight in place that would justify any kind of increased lending back to the NBFCs.
It's interesting you speak about AQRs for NBFCs just like it was done for banking, and that kind of, you're right, galvanized political reform in the banking cleanup space. 2 quick last questions and before we let you go. And one of them has to be on agriculture. In your economic survey, many people believe, quote unquote, you floated the big balloon of universal basic income. Given the agrarian stress, do you believe it's feasible to look at the universal basic income? Is it feasible to look at cash transfers? And do we have the resources?
So let me make a controversial prediction and then talk about the substance. I think my own risky thing that I'm hazarding now is that, especially in the aftermath of this election and especially after what's happened in the last couple of years in agriculture, my strong suspicion and prediction is that almost every political manifesto heading into the 2019 election will have some commitment to some sort of universal basic income. I should be held responsible for that prediction. Don't forget to do that 6 months down the road when the manifestos come out. Do we have the space for that? I think a lot is going to depend upon what kind of UBI it's going to be. Is it going to be done by the center or by the states? I think that's going to be, for example, the Telangana Raitu Bandhu scheme, which could well be a model for similar UBIs experiments in other parts of India. If a state does it, I think actually you probably need less additional fiscal headroom, because the states can tell the center, give us whatever you're giving, but just don't tell us what we should use it for. We might want to use some of it for UBI. But if the center were to take a commitment on this, then of course it might have to be additional to whatever government spending that takes place, and that we have to finding resources for that might be a little bit more difficult. So it's going to be dependent very much on where it's done, how it's done, those factors.
Okay. Fair point. If they do go this populist way, we'll have one man to blame, and that will be you at the Harvard University now. But last question to you. What is it that we need to do as a nation to hold back technocrats like yourselves, like Urjit Patel, and like Raghuram Rajan?
hold us back. I thought we were unambiguously positive public goods. So I resent the fact that you think we have to be held back. We have to be unleashed even more, I think.
I really meant holding you back in India. But on that note, Dr. Subramanian, thank you very, very much for being with us. Unleash your intellectual power on the world and let some of us benefit from it. Thank you very much for being with us and joining us right here on the India Economic Conclave.